Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. I'm Jeremy Munson, a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota, and with us again today is Walter Hudson, a city councilman from Albertville. And we're going to break down what happened this week in national and local politics as we saw the Virginia governor's race and House of Delegates go back into Republican hands. And we saw many races across Minnesota, local referendums, elections, school board elections, and of course the initiative in Minneapolis to defund the police failed. So all this and more on this episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. So Walter, great news this week as we saw the election results in Virginia come in. It wasn't a landslide win for Republicans, but Republicans did win, and people are celebrating. I know that there's still ballots that can come in. They're still going to find some, ballots in a trunk and stuff. But I think that Virginia's election is much more secure and has higher integrity than the election in Minnesota. So I'm confident that we're going to pull this one off. What was your initial reaction? Were you expecting a win down there? And do you think that Virginia, the swing state, and those results can apply to Minnesota's gubernatorial race next year?
Oh man, yes, and yes. There's just so much to dig into there. First, did I expect a win? I'm not gonna lie. It wasn't until very late in the game, like the last half week, last 2-3 days, that I increasingly got the sense that there was a very real possibility that Youngkin was going to defeat McAuliffe. And the reason why is not just the massive tectonic shift in the polling that we saw leading up to election day, but just there's something in the air, right? Like there's a certain intangibility to the sense of political momentum that was reflected in the increasing desperation and clownishness that was on display from the McAuliffe campaign and the mainstream media, and the fact that the issues, when issues are the central focus of a campaign, the rule of thumb is Republicans win. When personalities are the central focus of a campaign, Democrats tend to win. Not a tried and fast 100% all the time rule, but a pretty decent rule of thumb. And the issues were at the center of this campaign in the latter days. And what were those issues? Education, parental rights, medical freedom, the economy. I mean, things that are meaningful, especially education. Education became the crown jewel of the Youngkin campaign in the final days. And his message was simply this: you are the custodian of your child. As a parent, you get to decide what is in your child's best interest. And he successfully put McAuliffe, and we should say voluntarily placed McAuliffe, like McAuliffe volunteered for this, placed McAuliffe in the position of having to defend the idea that no, you're not. No, you are not in charge of your own child's education. No, you should not get to decide. And when that became the issue, it was like, oh, this is it. This is golden. This is fantastic. This is the goose that laid the golden egg. And indeed, that's how it played out. And you asked the question of the implications for broader elections. I put out a tweet late last night that got more traction than my tweets typically do, saying that I hope the MNGOP is watching this and taking notes and recognizing that Youngkin, in his conduct of the campaign in the latter days, was in complete defiance of all of the political conventional wisdom that dominates Republican politics in the state of Minnesota. Any professional consultant on the market in Minnesota would advise Youngkin to do the opposite of what he did. And what were the results? He flipped a blue state. Seems kind of relevant to what we have going on here in the land of 10,000 lakes. And so, yes, absolutely. This is a yeoman's work course in exactly how to flip a state from blue to red, and it's all about focusing on the third rail social issues that all the professionals tell you need to avoid and tread carefully on, and digging in and going to the extreme, and really pulling out the rug from under all of that conventional wisdom. And we can dig into the details of what all of that looks like as we continue our conversation here tonight.
Yeah, and you brought up, I think it was in your tweet, you mentioned the third rail issues. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the political term, when you have electric trains, there's the third rail where that, if you touch that one, you're going to get electrocuted. There are certain things that in politics you just don't go to because it is so risky. And that did not hold Youngkin back. He was talking about the very polarizing, divisive issues in much in the manner that Trump did. Just go head on, and we're going to have a conversation about them. And he talked about them, and he ignited the base, and he brought people over from that were in moderate and even on the Democrat side crossed over because he was willing to have conversations about those important issues. After a win like this, I tend to gravitate towards the liberal media because I want to hear their reaction. Part of it's kind of just, I love to hear somebody, cry on the news, but I also just want to hear their interpretation of what happened. What was unique about it, I turned into MSNBC as I was running the kids into school and running some errands. MSNBC was saying that Youngkin didn't reach out to Trump. He didn't get Trump's endorsement. He didn't bring Trump in to campaign for him. They said, well, he distanced himself for Trump. I don't think he did that. I think he just ran his own campaign how he wanted. He wanted to be his own man. And so they can't blame this win on Trump helping him. But at the same time, he ran a different campaign, and they were, kind of painting him as somebody like Trump. But I don't buy it. I think he was just honest. I think the issues were very local. And as you mentioned, Terry McAuliffe made that fatal mistake of saying that the state should be, that the parents shouldn't have any say in how their kids are educated. I mean, that was just stupid,
Well,
So
and then he walked it back, and then he doubled down, and yeah, it was just an incredibly, but it was honest. He really believes that, and his side and his supporters in the teachers unions and the education establishment believe that. They believe that they should have ownership of your child and your child's education. And so it wasn't just that it was a gaffe. It brought to light the reality of what was at stake in the election.
And one of the important things about this election on Tuesday, when we look at other things going on in the nation, is that President Biden, I mean, he's out and doing the climate summits and trying to, usher in climate, correcting our climate in the world. But his main goal right now is to get through this, enormous infrastructure bill and the huge tax increases. Now it's extending to people under $400,000 in income. And he wants to cram that through. That's his number one priority. And he's trying to get these moderate Democrats to go along and vote for it. And he was trying, it was very important for him to get that done before the election on Tuesday. Because if this election came out the way it did, now all the moderate Democrats are going to be afraid to follow Biden because they see what happened in Virginia as a referendum on his policies, and they're going to backpedal everywhere possible and distance themselves from the Biden agenda. And anywhere where they even hear a whisper of "Let's go, Brandon," they will back up and reel away. And so this is a huge win for us because there is a significant number of moderate Democrats who they've been, they're not going to get drawn to the far left DC, of their party. And that's a good thing that this election happened before they could get a vote on the infrastructure and the tax increases, because now it looks like that whole deal is going to fall apart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the I haven't focused too much in my thought and analysis on the referendum on the Biden administration angle, but obviously that exists and it's real and it's going to have an impact on things in 2022. You know, we're kicking off. I mean, basically, the midterm elections started Tuesday, right? Election season's in full force. You just returned from an event where we got to hear from the overwhelming majority of the gubernatorial candidates here in Minnesota. So campaign season's in full force for 2022, and this is how it's starting. This is the tone that has been set, and it's one where the left, who we've often talked about on this show in envious fashion, how the left leaves nothing on the bench and they leave it all out on the field, and there's no length to which they're not willing to go in order to advance their agenda. The problem, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. The problem is what they're advocating for. And when they go full force like this and they let the mask slip and they say the quiet part out loud and tell you what they really think of you and your children, it that's when there's the opportunity, and it is an opportunity, not an assurance, for Republicans to say, "See, this is what you're voting for or against," and we represent the opposite of that. And it's specifically to the extent that Republicans articulate a strong, decisive, and proactive alternative to the Democrats that they will find success like Youngkin did in Virginia.
Well, in addition to some of the things that are changing in DC for national policy, we also had a major election in Minnesota. We didn't have legislative races or gubernatorial races, but we had municipal races and school board races and school board referendums across the state. There were some big wins. There were some big losses. There were a lot of conservatives running for school board that just got shut out. In St. Peter, near me, we had major losses. We have now a very liberal mayor, city council members, school board members won. It was not a good night for a lot of cities, but in the city of Minneapolis, I want to just read part of an email I got from Patrick Kulikin from the Daily Reformer. Sends out this kind of synopsis of what happened, and he said, as the results came in Minneapolis Tuesday night, I reached out to a DFL operative working on the progressive side. Bloodbath, I texted. Bloodbath, the person texted back. Right. This another retired journalist and progressive activist said, well, that was an ass kicking. Right. That people in Minneapolis, it was a bad night. There were a lot of people in politics, a lot of powerful politicians, Keith Ellison, Ilhan Omar, pushing for defunding the police. That entire movement came crumbling down, was crushed last night by people in North Minneapolis voting that issue down, right? The people that are most impacted by not having a proper staffing of police, by police not enforcing the law, they voted it down. It was a great win for the people of Minneapolis. And it was great to be in rural Minnesota watching that happen, because we want to visit Minneapolis, right? We want Minneapolis to be safer. And so that was a very good initiative, a good failure in politics. And so I'm so glad that happened, because and there was some another thing I want to point out is that Mayor Fry, as much as we dislike him, was reelected last night, and he was one of the few people running for mayor that actually was against that referendum. So he's back in power. As incompetent as we think he is, he still supports the police in somewhat. So what are your thoughts on that initiative?
Well, look, I think it's telling that the left in control of politics in the city of Minneapolis regards the maintenance of the status quo as a quote bloodbath, unquote. In other words, the fact that they were stopped in their tracks as they tried to run the car off the cliff, the fact that somebody pulled the parking brake, the electorate pulled the parking brake and said, no, that's cool. We'd rather live. We'd rather continue to exist as such, as we always have. That's considered a major failure and a bloodbath by the DFL, by the left, by progressives. That's telling. But I think for our side, for Republicans, for conservatives, the lessons here need to be parsed through, much like the broader lessons of coming out of Virginia, and really taken to heart and integrated into the ongoing campaigns going to 2022. We cannot write off the urban core. We can, and I mean that in two different ways, because I think there's two different ways that we can write off Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding inner ring suburbs. The first way is the most obvious, which is to just not even try, to not go there, to not talk to people, to assume that they're not going to vote for you, to assume that they're all loyal to the Democrats and they're all a bunch of leftist advocates who love Black Lives Matter and hate the police. That's one way to write them off. I think another way to potentially write them off is to assume that in order to talk to them, in order to engage with them, you have to moderate your message. You have to play with kid gloves and act like you don't actually believe what you actually believe. I don't think that's true either. First of all, it comes off, if you try that strategy, people are going to see through it immediately. It comes off as disingenuous, pandering nonsense, because it is. And then secondarily, the people who were looking, it's not like we're looking to go into Minneapolis and get 50% plus one, right? That's not the goal at this point. The goal at this point is to squeeze as many votes out of that area as we can, just as it is in every other part of the state. That should be the goal. Squeeze as many votes as you can. And so where are those votes in Minneapolis and St. Paul? I think they're in the same places, residing in the hearts and minds of the same types of voters that we're looking for everywhere else. And that's the independent. Now, let me step aside for a second here and talk about independence, because I think the assumption that many politicos across the board make is that an independent is some squishy, moderate, indecisive wuss who has no idea what they believe or why they believe it, and just kind of follows whatever sounds good and is easily pandered to. Because what are the types of advice that you get for how to attract the independent vote? Well, you got to moderate your message. You gotta talk about bipartisanship. You've got to avoid the third rail social issues. You've got to do all these things that make you sound less like what you're projecting to your base. We know for a fact, I can say now, without speculation, and so can you and so can everybody else, we now know for a fact that's not true. That doesn't work. You know who the independent is? Just anecdotally. Who do you know? Who have you ever met who described themselves as an independent who fit that description that I just offered? Mushy, doesn't know what they believe, is hoping for somebody who's soft-spoken, right? Like all the independents that I know, people who describe themselves as independent, the reason they call themselves that is because they're sick to death of one party or the other for not fulfilling their campaign promises and having integrity and actually doing something and accomplishing something. And so you look at Donald Trump, who has outperformed Republicans in this state, almost flipped it red, completely redrew the political map from coast to coast. He was able to do that by appealing to independents and Democrats, activating Republicans, but also appealing to independents and Democrats, not by being some mushy middle guy who was afraid to piss anybody off, but the opposite, doubling down, saying, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I'm going to do. That's what people want. And if that's the type of campaigns that we present in 2022, you're going to get those independent votes out of places like Minneapolis and St. Paul from the voters who are there and who are waiting for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that many independents are people that are just upset with both parties, or they have major issues that they agree with both parties. And so they may vote for they may be Republican for certain elections and Democrats for other elections, because they know that maybe if immigration's their big issue, they know that we don't handle immigration at the state level. We don't handle immigration at the county commission or a city level. And so they may be with Democrats on one issue and, Republicans on a different level. But overall, I think so many people, I mean, I don't agree 100% with the Republican platform. I'm with us 80%, 85% of the time. And I'll tell you that most Republican legislators aren't actually Republican half the time because they vote against our own platform. So we need to figure out what our values are and what the values are of people that are on the independent side and go after them. And I think Donald Trump found a lot of those people by campaigning on those third rail issues you're talking about, this really, the bold issues that most politicians don't even talk about. But in the city of Minneapolis, what we should be seeing is that a majority of people in the city of Minneapolis support law and order. And had Governor Walz actually supported that ballot initiative, which I'm sure that his campaign people were telling him, boy, you should really just kind of stay clear of that. Had he supported it, he would be DOA for a statewide campaign. He's lucky he didn't support it. And this is going to be an interesting campaign next year when Ellison is caught having supported that. And as the chief law enforcement officer in the state, will have to explain himself at every single campaign stop. And so that is a big win for our attorney general candidates.
Well, and Tim Walz shouldn't be left out of hook or off the hook, and shame on us if we allow him to be. This is his party. These are his activists. This is his base. He is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party in the state of Minnesota. He needs to take a position on this issue. He needs to be asked, why didn't you come out one way or the other on this question? Do you support your attorney general for coming out for it? How do you see the future of policing in Minnesota? And he needs to give clear answers. He needs to be forced to give clear answers on that. To your point regarding the fact that the majority of people in Minneapolis support law and order, one of the things that I found definitive, I was recording my other podcast last night during the election, and at the time, only 5 of like 130 at 5 precincts in Minneapolis had reported, but I already knew how it was going to turn out. And the reason why I knew was because the question 1 and question 3, because there were 3 questions total, the defund the police, replace it with public safety question was number 2. Questions 1 and 3 were the inverse in terms of results from question 2. And questions 1 and 3 were both lefty causes. So that what that tells me is that people who are generally left-leaning, generally progressive, supported questions 1 and 3 and opposed question 2. That told me right off the bat, with only 5 precincts out of 135 reporting, that question 2 was going to lose. And the reason why, and this is extremely encouraging, is because there is and this is always true, there is a functional limit to the amount of hypocrisy, or let me phrase this differently. There's a functional limit to the amount of integrity that a progressive can have if they want to live. If a progressive wants to live, they must be a hypocrite because their ideas don't work. Everything that they advocate for is anti-life, irrational, dysfunctional, and fails. If they were to fulfill it in its entirety, they would die. We know this because we have practical examples in the form of the Soviet Union, Venezuela, the list goes on. These ideas do not work. Getting rid of the police and replacing it with social workers and therapists and counselors is not going to stop violent crime. People inherently know that. And so there comes a point in the progressive's life, various decision points, where they have to make the decision: how much do I really believe this stuff? How much do I want to live in the world that these ideas actually advocate for, versus just being able to say that I agree with this stuff for the sake of virtue signaling and social cohesion? And there is an answer to that question, and we discovered it last night. When you because it's not just BLM activists and pink-haired crazies running around in Minneapolis. There are families there. There are people who are raising their kids there. There are business owners. There are people who are sending their kids to school. There are normal people living in those cities. And they have to ask themselves the question, and you pointed out North Minneapolis and the direction they went. They have to ask themselves the question, do I really want to live in the world that's being advocated for by these guys who say they're on my side? And last night the answer was no. And that's great for us. And we should capitalize on that.
Let's talk about the third initiative in Minneapolis, the one that passed last night. And this was the rent control ballot initiative. So this doesn't have as much teeth as the one in St. Paul, which also passed last night. We talked about that one in the podcast a couple episodes ago, where it puts a 3% maximum increase on the rent every year, and you have to go before the city council or a group and ask for permission to improve your property in order to raise your rent. And it's a horrible decision. That one is going to be the most restrictive rent control ordinance in the entire country. That one passed last night. And in Minneapolis, it passed, except theirs is pretty vague language and requires the city council to basically put forward an ordinance that the voters would then vote again on. And so there's another shot at killing this thing. And it's very possible that the mayor who opposes rent control will just not approve an ordinance to be put on the ballot. So it could just die in the city council. We'll see. But the landlords, property owners, housing providers, as they're called at the Capitol, they spent almost $4 million lobbying against these rent control initiatives, and their campaign failed. So we just have not been teaching our children about socialism, and we've not been teaching them how the free market works. And that's on us. That's a failure of us as a society when you can have socialism like this pass in a ballot initiative. It's frightening. So we need to do better in teaching just general economics. Right now, as a result, in St. Paul, there will be a lot of rental units that will struggle. They'll deteriorate, and then they'll have to be converted to condominiums because that's the only out for a property owner that has an 8-plex that they want to improve and rent. They won't be able to make it, not when the property taxes and everything else goes up every year, or even we have inflation at 4%. If you can only raise your rent 3%, you're losing every year. And so the only way around this now is to just convert your property to condos and sell it, that's really the only option. So we'll see a lot of conversions into condos. And then there'll be new construction for apartment buildings in South St. Paul or all these cities that are around St. Paul, Roseville, and that's where the development will go. And with it, jobs, and we'll start the slow turn of changing St. Paul into the next Detroit. That's the outcome.
That is exactly the analogy, the comparison that I was going to make is, I was born in Detroit. I remember what it looks like. And I remember, in fact, I used to tell people that when my dad brought me with on the first scouting trip to Minnesota, and we got off the plane and we got outside the airport, that for me, it was a moment like in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy opens her house and sees color for the first time in Munchkin Land. That's what it felt like coming to Minnesota from Detroit. There's hills, there's grass, there's a big blue sky with clouds in it. There's none of that in Detroit. It's flat, it's gray, it's dirty, it's dank. Like it's limbo. It's not a place you want to live. But beyond the weather and all of that, we know what the economic policies of leftists in Detroit has wrought. Empty buildings, dilapidated buildings, empty lots. I remember growing up younger than my son and passing the empty houses, the abandoned houses, the empty lots. And, you didn't think anything of it because you didn't know any better. But I look back on that now and it's inconceivable to me to be in a neighborhood where there are empty houses, dilapidated properties, empty lots, condemned properties. But that's what St. Paul has opted for. And the reason why is, you go and you look at the inflation rate over the course of the past 4 or 5 years, it's oscillated between 2.13 and 1.23, that's anywhere from 1/3 to over 2/3 of the amount of rent control that's just been applied by the city of Minneapolis. So you're saying that they're going to have, like you had pointed out when we discussed this before, if you're a landlord in St. Paul, you're going to have to increase your rent by the maximum every single year for that reason alone. And hope that you never need to invest anything at all into maintaining your capital, to maintaining the property, or let alone improving it. Nobody's going to be doing that. Nobody's going to be investing in properties in St. Paul.
Yeah, and I
So
shared
yeah,
that, I lived in Santa Monica, or I looked for apartments in Santa Monica, and when I lived in Los Angeles, and because they have rent control there, all the apartments don't have refrigerators. Most of them don't have stoves or microwaves. So because that is an amenity that they just took out, none of them have laundry, right? So if you want to rent an apartment, yeah, it might be $1,200, but you have to spend $2,500 on major appliances for your apartment. That's the way they've got around the rent control increases. They've stopped investing in their properties, and it's just a downhill spiral. And yeah, it's not the right approach, St. Paul. I'm sorry that you voted this in, and maybe we can change it. Maybe we can get rid of it. But it's really tough to undo this, because now when you undo rent control in the future, the campaign is so easy against it to say, the campaign is so easy against undoing it, because you're going to say, well, you're going to increase, you're going to vote to increase, you're going to vote to kick grandma out of the house. You're going to vote to, you're going to have personal stories of what you're going to be doing to people. And then it's very difficult to undo a handout like this to people. And so it's going to be a hard campaign.
yeah, you're going to need a paradigm shift in the city of St. Paul that I can't think of an example of where that's been modeled in the past. Detroit still votes for Democrats. Okay, with
Yeah.
their decades long history. Baltimore. You look at any of these cities, and so yeah, it's looking grim if you want to have any sort of decent existence and quality of life in Minneapolis or St. Paul. I would get out.
Yeah, and I can imagine a major developer coming to St. Paul in a few years when they're in dire straits for housing, and saying, "Look, I'll build these, or I'll take over the management of these 40 properties, but you will make me exempt from the rent, the rent control issue." And so I think the city council might start awarding developers these sweetheart deals that they're going to keep rents at living or whatever costs, but they're going to be exempt from this, and then we're going to have the city council picking winners and losers again. Let's jump to some other local races yesterday, or local elections. Tell us about what happened in St. Michael-Albertville schools with your referendum that you've been talking about in previous episodes of this podcast.
Yeah, well, for me, yesterday was 100% just victorious and validating and awesome. Every race that I was following went the way that I wanted / anticipated it would go. And that extended down even here locally to our operating levy that was on the ballot. It was the single question. This is the amazing thing. It was the only question on the ballot. It's an off year, even year election. And my experience going to the polls, and then anecdotally the posts I was seeing on social media of what other people were seeing at the polls, you wouldn't have known if you'd have just dropped somebody in to the line, or dropped them into the room of where the balloting was taking place, and asked them, what do you think's going on here today? They would have told you general election, maybe non-presidential, maybe 2022. But the enthusiasm of the voters to come out and participate in this one question of whether or not we're going to tax ourselves to fund the schools was just astounding. And I had good vibes, a good sense of the direction things were going to go, just anecdotally by seeing who was there. There's a lot of older people. A lot of our elders in this community came out to vote. And you got to ask yourself,
You don't live in a huge community. You've got basically two small towns neighboring each other, St. Michael and Albertville. And I don't know how many voters typically vote in your elections during maybe the presidential election last year. Maybe you have, I don't know. I don't know how many thousands of people, but you had almost 6,000 people come out and
Yeah.
vote on this referendum. In towns this size, school board elections, whatever, you might have, 500 or 1,000 people vote. It's very low voter turnout. You had almost 6,000 people show up to vote on this referendum.
Yeah, I mean, the population of Albertville alone is 7,400 people. Okay, so almost the entire population of Albertville. Now, of course, this is Albertville and St. Michael combined of people who showed up, but it totaled almost the complete population of Albertville, the number of people who showed up to vote on this one question. And like I say, the composition of people who were showing up, it was a lot of folks who were our elders. And when I asked myself, what's motivating this guy, this gal, to come out and make their voice heard, well, who's going to be most adversely impacted by an enormous spike in property taxes? Probably somebody who's operating on a fixed income. Probably somebody who doesn't have many opportunities to see their cost of living go up and be able to compensate for that somehow. And so, and also the fact that they're well beyond their childbearing years, right? They don't have kids in the system. Maybe they've got grandkids, great grandkids in the system. But that to me spoke to the very to the trend, to the tendency of what might be motivating people to come out. And indeed, when the night fulfilled its course, the question failed, and it failed decisively. And what's remarkable to me about that, and the other reason why I had a sense that it was going to go that way, because we don't have polling in tiny municipal elections, right? So you don't have any sort of objective data to base your prognostication upon. But the other thing that told me that this was probably the direction things were going to go was the perceived desperation of the vote yes side in the final days. I mean, it was every single day with social media posts and bombarding, every board regarding, this is so important. Our kids' education is gonna go into the toilet if we don't vote for this. Please support the kids, and increase demonization of anybody who was opposed to it. Which of course we knew was going to happen, and it's a hell of a sales pitch, right? Like when you get to that point, when the Girl Scout comes to your door and is selling cookies, and she gets to the point where she's calling you, some sort of reprobate because you won't buy Thin Mints. That's the point in the sales pitch where things have gone sideways, right? And that's where they were at. And so it wasn't a surprise that things ended up the way that they did. And again, I hope the right lessons are taken from it. Because even though as I describe it, hold on just a second, I gotta yell at my dog. Hey, get down.
I'm leaving that in the podcast, just so you know.
You should. At any rate, even though it seems as though I'm gleeful that the levee failed, I wish, and I'm not gonna lie, I wish the circumstances had been presented wherein it could have passed. I wish we found ourselves, and this goes beyond St. Michael-Albertville. I mean, it was part of Loudoun County. It was part of Virginia. It's part of why Youngkin won. There is a phenomenon that's taking place in this country right now where people are realizing what's at stake, and it is nothing less than the culture. We are in a culture war. That is a common piece of political rhetoric that people tend to roll their eyes when they hear it, but it is true. We are at war for our culture and our values and our capacity to live according to our chosen values. And that war starts, and to a large degree ends, in education. And this question over who ought to have influence, control even, over what your child is taught and the values that inform policy in your schools is the central question that will decide the direction that that ultimate battle goes. And so what we need on our school boards, what we need in administration offices and in classrooms, is we need people that are committed to opposing critical theory in all its satanic form. We need people who are committed to teaching children how to think, not what to think, to teaching basic academics, reading, writing, arithmetic, science, STEM. And you know, and it's not that we're not going to talk about racism. Oh, you know, the conservatives don't want to talk about racism. I'm happy talking about racism all day long, as much as you want. But we're going to talk about it objectively. We're going to talk about it historically. We're going to talk about it factually. And we're going to provide students with the rational capacity to deal with these issues as intelligent and rational beings rather than as emotional tools for a political agenda. And, you know, so if our school board had done that, if they had come out and said, you know, as we survey the political landscape, we see all of these threats to the values that we know St. Michael-Albertville hold, critical theory, whether it's critical gender theory, critical race theory, in all its forms, the desire to impose harmful policies on our students, as has been done in neighboring Montrose, Hanover, I forget the other city that's involved in the district, but we got a neighboring district where they were sued and these gender bathroom policies were imposed. Anoka Hennepin was sued and gender bathroom policies were imposed. So these threats are real. You know, social studies standards coming from your friends at the legislature, those are imminent. Those are going to happen. And so what we need from school boards is a declaration of war, a declaration of independence that says we are not going down that road. We are going to maintain the academic excellence that we always have, and that is our singular focus, and we will vehemently oppose any judge, any politician, any governor who tries to tell us otherwise. They'd have won 70-30. But they weren't willing to do that.
And there was a school board member, school board candidate who won handedly. I think they were in the Anoka school district or something. It was on the north side of the metro. And they actually, their only issue was against CRT. It was on their campaign signs. Their name, I'm against CRT. And they won with like 70% of the vote. They just smoked them. People willing to make that stance. And we talked about that. Tonight, I went to a gubernatorial debate in Mankato, where 5 of the candidates, so all the candidates except for Benson, showed up, and the gloves came off a little bit. It was a good debate. But before the debate, I was talking to many Republican leaders and talking about school board elections. And they were talking about how they were told to, you know, maybe we should just hold off on running candidates until, you know, the filing period, the last day of the filing period, and just kind of like, you know, silently, you know, get them in the race. It's like, no, you need to get out there and talk about it, because there are conservative candidates running, but you don't even know where they are. You can't even identify them because they're afraid to talk about the issues, right? We need to identify them, make them loud and proud of what they're running for. And that's how you get people out, because especially on these off-year elections, when the school boards and the city council and all the local races happen, this is where it comes down to voter turnout. And we can turn out people if we have a reason to go out and vote. But if you don't talk about the issues, we're not coming out to vote.
That's right.
And that's why, you know, the Democrats have been cleaning our clock for 30 years, because they have been taking over all the school boards and city council seats, even in conservative districts, because Republicans don't get out and campaign and get out and vote. And they have the Minnesota Department of Education and the unions out door knocking for them. And the Republican Party apparatus is not endorsing local candidates. The DFL has been doing it for decades. We don't endorse our local candidates. Very rarely does the BPOU or the Republican Party endorse a nonpartisan race.
Yeah, no, I think that should change. I think it'd be a great way to get, because right now, again, anecdotally, there is zero, and I do mean zero, excluding myself, there is no cross-pollination between the municipal government in Albertville or St. Paul and the Republican Party in Wright County. Okay. Like, and part of that is because they hold the Wright GOP holds their monthly meetings on the same night that we have our council meetings, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I've raised that issue and asked them to change it. But it's also just a question of like, why would we? Why would my mayor be involved with the Wright GOP? There's no reason to be. Why would my school board members want to engage with the Wright County GOP? They have no reason to. But if they got involved, the GOP got involved in endorsements and municipal races and having something to say and reaching out and engaging and offering support, then there would be a reason for candidates and incumbents to pay attention to what conservative activists in this area are thinking and saying. And to your point about conservative areas, it doesn't get much more conservative than Wright County. And yet here in St. Michael-Albertville, I've had a hell of a time getting my school board to pay attention to these issues and take them seriously. And a big part of the reason is the culture that I want to be careful here and how far I go in condemning this, because there certainly are potential facts that I'm not aware of. But it seems to me, I'll say that, it seems to me that a culture has been created by certain staff in the district that school board members have been coached and trained to be tame and silent and to not make waves and to not say what they think and to not be bold. Everything is very deliberate and packaged and sanitary and driven by committee and opinion, and you look in your finger and stick it in the air and seeing which way the wind is blowing. And that's not leadership. What we need on these school boards is leadership. We need people who are willing to say, this is what's right. This is the direction we ought to go. And this is how we should go there. And come with me and take this hill. That's what we need. And I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how things develop. There were no board members on the ballot this time around, but it'll be interesting to see the trajectory of these types of races as we move into 2022 and beyond.
Well, Walter, your desire for leadership at the school board is about the same that I feel when I went to the gubernatorial debate tonight. We need the same kind of thing in our gubernatorial candidates. We need people taking bold stances. And we had on the stage tonight Mike Marty, who's probably at the back of the pack, small business owner from Casson down here in southern Minnesota. Been planning to run for governor for years. Got his business structured in a way that allows him to afford him time to run. He's all in. Senator Gazelka, former Senate Majority Leader, the former most powerful Republican in the state of Minnesota, was there tonight. And then Dr. Scott Jensen, he came out pretty well in the debate tonight. And then Dr. Neil Shah, who I think by all accounts was the best speaker tonight. I think he won the night. And then Mike Murphy was also there. Senator Benson could not make it, but it was a really interesting debate. But there were some bold issues offered, some stances. They had a very structured forum where they played the videos of all the candidates as they came on stage. They introduced themselves for a minute. Then they answered 6 questions. They got 3 minutes each to answer questions, and then they took questions from the audience, and it got pretty fiery. There were a few times people were heckled by audience members, but people were frustrated, especially for Gazelka, and somewhat for Jensen, because they served in the legislature, and they were taken to task for not doing enough for conservatives. And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch these debates as the gloves come off. I mean, Gazelka and Jensen, probably the front runners. Maybe Neil Shaw's right up there. I think the more people listen to Neil Shah. I think they're very interested in what he has to say. But Jensen and Gazelka are definitely out front, and the gloves are coming off. They're taking swings at each other. So it was interesting to see, and we'll see what happens at the next few debates. But I think that the people really want the bolder the answers they gave, the better the response from the audience. It's not pandering to tell people to make some bold statements, but obviously, they don't want to hurt themselves in the general election, right? That's when you're in a primary battle. You also have to look at these bold decisions that you're making. You're going to have to explain to the general election voter that how this is going to work. But if you can choose the right path that works, we saw what happened in Minneapolis, where people came out and voted down crazy leftist ideology. You need to take that to the people. They will support you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I don't think this dichotomy that has always just been taken for granted between campaigning for endorsements and primaries and campaigning in the general election is as stark as a lot of people seem to make it and accept it. The idea that you have to basically say one thing and then say something completely different in both of those modes. First of all, it's just blatant hypocrisy, right? And it is pandering. Like, you use that word pandering. What does that mean? Well, when I'm pandering to somebody, I'm telling them what I think they want to hear insincerely, meaning I don't actually believe it. I don't actually intend it. It's not actually important to me. It's not pandering if you mean it. Like, Donald Trump wasn't pandering when he said he was going to build the wall. Was that red meat? Did it drive people crazy? Did it bring people out to support him? Absolutely. But it wasn't pandering, because he was going to build that wall. Like, he meant it. That was his intention. And so I think that's what you need. And then as far as how to handle it in the general election, you just stay the course. Just say, yeah, that's what I said, and I meant it. And then, we've talked about this before. What you do is you don't walk it back or try to dial it down. You just change the context. What you do is you make it relevant to the audience you're speaking to, right? So when you go, I think the example we talked about before was when Mike Murphy had said that Minneapolis was a S-hole,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, he says that, and it's great red meat, drives people nuts outstate. Let's say it gets some support. He ends up with the endorsement and wins the primary, and he's on the general ballot. Well, certainly they're going to come back at him and be like, you called Minneapolis an asshole. Why should anybody in Minneapolis vote for you? If I'm him, my answer is because I'm right. And they know it because they live there. They know more than anybody else the status of their city. And that's why they should vote for me, because I'm the guy who's going to make it better. So you stay the course with your message, but you make it relevant because, like I say, you don't need to get 50% plus one in Minneapolis. You need to get that guy who's sitting there sunken, dejected, sunken into the love seat in his apartment, feeling as though he's not being represented and nobody agrees with him. You need to get that guy fired up and off his couch and running down to the polls and enthusiastically pulling the lever for a Republican. And that's how you do it.
One of the things that I thought, so I'm going to just pull a few things from different candidates that I thought were important. I'm going to start with Mike Marty because he's the underdog. I haven't seen a lot of traction from his campaign yet, but we'll see if he shifts gears. When we were talking about the Second Amendment, he had a great comeback and saying, just basically talking about how important stand your ground and how important constitutional carry is. He said, you are your own first responder. And I thought that was a really powerful statement, especially for people in Minneapolis that went through that riot. That was good. But when he was talking about CRT, a lot of people are talking, we should ban CRT. I've got a friend in Florida who's a state legislator, and he's pushing legislation to ban CRT in schools. get it in, put it in law. Well, Mike Marty said, how do you do that? Because you can say we're going to ban CRT and they'll just call it something different. You can't stop it unless you run for office. And we have to get people into the school boards, into the legislature who are committed to stopping it. And it's not just about passing legislation. It's about constantly preventing whatever the next version of that is, whatever they call it. We just have to change the dynamic of the legislature and the school boards. And so we can't just tell them you need to stop this and pass an ordinance or a resolution or legislation against it. You need to have people in office that are going to constantly fight against. And I thought that was really important.
I think that's wrong on two fronts, both in terms of the substance of what he's saying and politically. Politically, it's wrong because you're giving people an answer that provides them with no reason to vote for you. Whenever your answer is, well, we shouldn't do what you want because in order to achieve that, you need to go vote for somebody else in somebody other race. Oh, okay. Well, I guess I don't need you then. Like, that's what people are going to be thinking, right?
Okay.
But then in terms of the substance, you can stop it with ordinance, with law. You know how I know that? Because if I go down to my local middle school or high school and I try to put together a club where we're going to get together and we're going to pray. We're going to get together and we're going to hold Sunday service on Friday at the school, open door in a classroom to any student who wants to attend. That's going to get shut down pretty quick. And the reason why is because it's recognized that that is a violation of the sense of what we call separation in church and state. But what it really is it's transcending the academic mission to become a kind of missionary practice of a religious worldview. And that's what CRT is. When I say I want to ban critical race theory, I don't mean that I don't want students to know it exists. Like, that's not it. And that's the kind of the straw man that gets thrown out there. I run into it all the time in my discussions with people on this topic, where they're like, oh, you don't want to talk about race and you want to pretend that critical race theory doesn't. No, I enthusiastically advocate for the teaching of fact regarding critical race theory, just like I enthusiastically advocate for the teaching of fact regarding Marxism, communism, Nazism, the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and all for the same reason. Because we need to be able to equip our children, our students, with the capacity to oppose these evil ideologies. Where the line gets crossed, it's one thing, and this, when I went to school, I'm sure the same was true for you, Jeremy. When I went to school, we learned about religion. We learned the academic facts, the who, what, when, where of Christianity, the who, what, when, where of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. That wasn't a violation of the separation of church and state. Nobody filed any lawsuits about that. But if the teacher got up and started having us sing hymns and engaging in a Bible study in a manner that is a practice of the faith, that would be crossing the line. And in a similar sense, critical race theory is not a subject, it's a practice. It's a thing that you do. And in order to understand that, you need only read and talk to the people who came up with it. They say explicitly, CRT is a practice. It's something you do. Well, we want to ban the practice of critical race theory and indeed critical theories of all kinds in our schools. And that is something we absolutely positively can do and enforce.
I'll agree with you on a lot of that. I don't think let's just say this. Let me back up here. So going to this debate tonight, what was important to me is that if any of these men, and I guess I'll say men because they were all men in this age, if any of these men win the governor's race, they will have the authority to usher through any of their policies that they want. Because if they win, we win the House and Senate. I don't think there's a scenario where we're going to win the governor's race and lose the Senate or the House.
Right.
Like it's going to be a sweep. And so we will have control for 2 years to get stuff through. And So if they have a bold policy like school choice, like giving, I think Senator Jensen or Dr. Jensen said we should have a policy about allowing 75% of the funding that's allocated for each kid, for $11,000 a year, whatever you get in Albertville, 75% of that money could follow the kid if they want to go to a private school or something, drastic like that, something bold to change. He would have the authority to get that done because the legislature would be Republican, and presumably that Republicans would go along with this. And so I think that what they're talking about doing tonight would be important. But what we don't have is we don't have the courts on our side, because that takes time. You need to sit and make all these appointments of judges. And so challenges to the legislation, pretty much any policy that Republican governors are going to sign into law, is going to be challenged by the Democrats because they have the courts. And so when you're trying to ban CRT, I got to edit out. When you're trying to ban CRT, that would be challenged by the Democrats through the courts, trying to change our policy and how it's defined. So it's difficult. And that was kind of why I thought his point was so important. You're trying to ban something by name, and that's difficult. They can just change what it is they're trying to get through, what it is they're trying to teach, and say, well, that doesn't apply because this isn't critical race theory. This is just how we teach history or something.
So you broaden the definition. And I'm thinking about this on the fly, so it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But you ban it categorically. You say we're going to ban mystic practices in public education. People will go look left and look right and go, what are we talking about? What is that? Well, the root of critical race theory is ethnic Gnosticism. It's the idea that I have access to knowledge about reality that you don't because of the color of my skin. It's the idea that the color of my skin makes me magic and subject to information that is inaccessible to a white person. That is mysticism. Okay? That's insane. That's like having voodoo in the school. All right? And you sell it. You don't even you could do this in a strategic way where you don't even really sell it as being about critical race theory. You could say, look, we agree with the vast majority of everyone, including our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that religion shouldn't be taught in schools, that mysticism has no role in academics. And so we're going to codify that. We're not going to allow the practice of mysticism in public education in Minnesota. And they'll all nod. At first, they'll all nod and be like, oh, yeah, sure, great. Well, it's kind of weird that you would bring that up, but sure. And then when they realize what you're doing, you're going to place them in the position where they have to defend the fact that what they're advocating for is voodoo. They want to not just teach about, but convert your child to a Gnostic belief system. And once that's the debate, we win.
Yeah. Well, my hope is that we win the governor's race. We take over the House and the Senate, and we start working on conservative policies, getting them in place. But I fear that many Republicans will jump into this big government top-down mandates that Republicans shouldn't like, and trying to direct their policies down on the schools. I would prefer that a governor get in there and eliminate the top-down mandates from the state and say, let's let the school boards set the curriculum. And then Republicans will pay a small price because we don't have conservatives elected to school boards. So, it can be viewed as something, but you're going to make Minneapolis happy. You're going to make the liberal cities happy. And you're going to make conservative cities happy because within a year, they're going to throw out their school boards and get conservatives elected. And that will make everyone happy. We can all live in peace if we give local control to our schools. But that's my hope. And if you just allow school choice, if you allow 75% or 100% of the money to travel with the kid, immediately the public schools will make a major change because they're going to want that money back. They're going to want the kids back. And that's ultimately the best thing we can do, is bring in a ton of choice for parents and let the money follow the student. And I think that running on policies of focusing on education and law and order are going to be big sellers in the 2022 election.
Yeah, I mean, it may be you make very solid, substantial points there. Um, I don't know if it's a and or it might be a and then or an and plus because yeah, absolutely, of course we if school choice isn't the number one legislative priority of an incoming Republican governor, then they are not worth voting for. That has to be top of the agenda, school choice. And it needs to get done. Because, like you say, if there's a sweep and we have total control of state government for 2 years, boy, we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work. Now, that's not something Republicans are historically good at, but it's what needs to happen. For both politically in terms of providing a value in exchange for the support you earned during the campaign to those who voted for you, but then also in taking ground, because it's in the holding of political power that you are truly able to take ground on all of these battlefields. And so, yes, you go for school choice, but I think also you do what the left does. The left doesn't play this either or game of, well, maybe we should do this but not that. They do everything. They throw it all at the wall to see what sticks. And sometimes they surprise themselves and they go, "Man, I didn't think that was going to work." And it did. We got Keith Ellison as our attorney general. Who'd have thunk, you know? And so sometimes you do the Hail Mary pass and you score a touchdown and win. That does happen. But unlike that specific situation where you only have one play you can run, if you have that type of political access and political control, you could be running all kinds of plays simultaneously and score the aggregate of however you come up from it, right? Like you can get school choice and make some progress on banning CRT and doing this, that over here on law and order. Like you don't have to pick one thing. And so I think we need to learn that characteristic or that tendency from our opponents on the other side of not being so careful that we make ourselves useless and impotent, because that's been the historical trend for Republicans nationwide.
Yeah. Well, want to give a quick update on what's happening in the legislature, which is pretty much nothing. We're likely not going to go back into special session. There's been the governor's been heeing and hawing about whether he should call us back for special session. The latest is that he will not, because Senator Gazelka is getting fired up by the base to fire Jan Malcolm. And of course, Jeremy Miller is the new Senate Majority Leader. He put out a statement basically saying that he was interested in doing that, also passing some prohibition on vaccine mandates for businesses would be top of his agenda as well. And so the governor doesn't want the Democrats in the House to have to vote on that, as every single Democrat in the House has constituents who are going to be fired for not being vaccinated, even though many of them have had the disease naturally. The show has two hosts, basically co-hosting the show. One of us has had COVID. One of us has not. Walter, I forgot to ask about this on the last episode, but I'm gonna be in front of Jan Malcolm tomorrow virtually for a Health and Human Services hearing. She's going to come and testify about what's going on in nursing homes, and inevitably we'll be asking her about vaccine mandates and why we're applying this to people who've had natural immunity. You had COVID just recently. You just got over it. Tell us about your experience with it, and why would you? Peggy Flanagan just got COVID. She's the lieutenant governor, and in her tweets about her and her daughter getting COVID, she followed it up with saying, "I can't wait to get over COVID so I can go and get another booster shot." Okay. So, I mean, here's somebody who is she's fully vaccinated. She got a breakthrough case, and she's sick, and she's so excited to get over COVID so she can go and get a booster shot. Does that make any sense to you? And tell us about your experience with COVID and how it completely wiped you out, or did it not?
Well, I mean, it wiped me out in the sense that I was really tired, exhausted, pretty useless. I mean, maybe you can go back because I'm not going to disclose when I had it. Um, but maybe you can go back and figure it out by watching or listening to past episodes because I worked right through it in term not I didn't go to work, but I did podcasts, I did remote stuff right through it. And I was fine. I managed, we did this show. But I couldn't go to work for obvious reasons. And also I was exhausted all the time. I would get these. I seem to have had a much milder case than a lot of other people have reported. Because for some people that I've talked to or heard from, they describe it as being like bedridden, where like you just can't get out of bed. You're so exhausted. I was very, very tired, but I was getting out of bed. I mean, I slept a lot. I would sleep a full 8, 9, 10 hours, wake up, do something for 2, 3 hours, go back to bed for 4, and then get up for 2, 3 hours, go back to bed for 8 to 10. So I slept a lot. But I wasn't dying. I was, our kid has a genetic condition, that requires us to have a pulse ox in the house so we can keep track of his blood oxygen levels. So I was checking my blood oxygen levels. I was fine. I was taking my temperature on a regular basis. It spiked for about 12 hours one night while I was sleeping. Otherwise, it was normal. It was like having the flu. Hate to say it, but it was like having the flu just for longer. That's it. It was like Groundhog Day. I would be sick and I would feel like I was getting better. I'd go to sleep, I'd wake up and I'd feel just as sick as I did the morning prior. So it was like Groundhog Day. I just would wake up and still be sick. And that was it. Like it was an inconvenience. I lost a week's wages. I got to hang out at home, even though I didn't really get to enjoy it because I was exhausted and not in tip top shape by any stretch of the imagination. But then I was fine. In addition to that, my kids both got it. My 12-year-old, my 8-year-old. Now, the only reason we know they got it is because we had them tested in an abundance of caution once we found out that I had it. And my wife got tested as well. So both of them had it. They tested positive. You never would have known it. They got a week off school. For them, it was probably the best thing that's happened to them this year. They got an extra week off school right at the beginning, right after the summer. And so, no, just non-issue. And so the point of all of this, of my experience, is for me and my family, and let's just pause to reflect that that's where medicine is targeted. Actual medicine is targeted at patients. This public health nonsense where we talk about everybody in the aggregate like we're all one big Borg collective is utter and complete nonsense that has no bearing upon individual lives. Medicine deals with the individual. And for me individually and my family as a unit, I was not, as a head of household, I was not tremendously concerned about COVID prior to getting it. Looking at the evidence, looking at the data, had no reason to be. I got it. My kids got it. We're fine. My concern has gone from negligible to non-existent because I now know for a fact that, not, first of all, I have natural immunity now, and so do my kids. But then also, if we were somehow to get it again, we'll be fine because we've already had it and we've already got the baseline test case. We'll be fine. So to me, it's no different than literally any other illness I might contract in my day to day. The flu, a cold, whatever the case may be. Yeah, there's always the chance that I'm going to get sick, and getting sick sucks. And when you do get sick or have reason to believe you're sick, you should take precautions to not get other people sick. All of that is true. We've always believed all those things. But the idea that I ought to shut down and fundamentally alter my way of life in order to avoid contracting an illness that makes me tie-tie for a week is completely absurd. And this kind of fell into stark relief for me today, actually, because, and I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going to let all you guys in on a little secret that you have to promise you're not going to tell my wife or my eldest son, because the two of them are out right now on a field trip, camping trip with school. They're going to be gone for a couple of nights. And so I took advantage of the opportunity to spend some quality time with my youngest son. And we went to the Mall of America today and rode on some rides. And I'm strapping myself into these rides. And it's funny how when you're younger, you're scared, but you don't really know why. And then as a teenager, a young adult, you get over it and you're willing to do anything. And then you get a little older and you start to realize, if I am one hydraulic leak away from certain death. Like this is not, this is not a good situation to be in. And, you trust it. You trust that the equipment's going to function. You trust that the attendant is competent and knows what they're doing and that you're going to be safe. And the vast majority of the time, you're right. The statistics on fatalities and injuries in amusement parks, very, very marginal. Even so, it isn't zero. It ain't zero. There have been injuries and there have been deaths. And dying in an amusement park is a particularly dramatic way to go. Okay. And so by strapping myself into these devices, these roller coasters, these rides, and my kid, my 8-year-old, into these rides, what I'm doing is I'm assuming that ever so marginal risk that I and or he will die horrific, painful, horrible deaths. And I'm taking that risk. Why? To feed our family? To cure cancer? No. For fun. For a thrill, for amusement. This is a thing that exists in the real world that we all do. We make risk calculations. We weigh our values against the facts, against the numbers, right? Like if you were analyzing the risks of an amusement park and your goal was, if we can save just one life, if your goal was, we need to have a zero death policy, a zero injury policy, and that's our objective here in this amusement park industry, then you just have to dismantle them because you're never going to get there. But that's not the only question. The statistics and the probabilities are not the only side of the issue. On the other side, you have people's individual values, even something as seemingly frivolous as having a good time. And as individual human beings, we accept as normal and moral and proper and good. The idea of a son or of a father taking his son to an amusement park is classic Americana, right? It's apple pie and rainbows, right? Like it's the American flag, an outing like that. We accept it as normal. But what is it? It is the assumption of a marginal, negligible amount of horrific risk to you and your child in order to have fun. There's a sense in which that trade-off runs 180 degrees opposite the morality and the worldview that is dominating our public health infrastructure and apparatus in this country and globally. And we need to recognize that and keep calling it out.
Well, you've hit on a lot of really important topics there, but people assessing their own risk and managing their own risk is central to health freedom, right? We all take risks every day in everything that we do. Every time we get in our car, we assess and we assume a risk. And the fact that the government has got involved and said, no, you have to do this as a matter of public health policy, right? It's been challenged, went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court found there's a reason there is a need for government to mandate vaccines in like 100-year-old case for certain illnesses. But to come in and push this, which doesn't prevent you from getting a disease, which doesn't prevent you from spreading it, breaks down the very concept of what the vaccine was supposed to do. Now, the latest evidence shows that a vaccine may give you personal protection. It may lessen your symptoms, your risk of death, but it doesn't risk other people. It doesn't lessen the risk for other people. That argument is waning. And furthermore, just, I mean, changing the definition of the vaccine, which we've talked about on the show before, also, drastic. But once you let the government in to say this is the public health policy because it's going to save lives, when all is said and done and we look back at COVID and why the United States was hit so hard compared to other countries, there's mounting evidence to suggest it's because of our obesity in our population, and that's why we're hit so hard. And is it going to usher in the government's new nanny state for caloric intake and saying, well, look, you get so much credit for how many calories that you can buy, that you can consume. Let's go back and look at those large sodas, which this is itty bitty, compared to most, right? My small Burger King pop, let's get rid of them, anything over 16 ounces. And that's the new nanny state, because quite honestly, a policy against obesity would probably save more lives than any vaccine mandates, if government wants to continue to push down this path of trying to save lives because of public policy. And because government's funding so much of the healthcare for so much of the population, it has a significant interest in reducing the obesity rate in America, especially if it's the reason why we're having so many deaths from COVID. And so it's frightening. Once you open that door and let government in to make your decisions for COVID, they can use the same arguments to make the decisions for so many other things in our lives. And that is what ultimately we have to talk to people in the metro, right? Talk to Democrats, talk to independents about liberty. But you can't sit and just pick away at the science of the vaccine. You have to talk about what it is about a personal decision, the my body, my choice thing.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, I'm sick to death of arguing the science, even though there most certainly is an argument to be had there, and it should be had. But that's not where this issue is going to be won. I hate to break it to you, but politics is never going to be won on the facts. Okay. The guy who has the iron tight case, we had Rick Weibel on the show, didn't we? Talking about election integrity, or was that one of the other deals
Probably one of the other deals.
Okay. Well, you could bring a guy in to give you his ironclad case as to all the things that are wrong with the election process in 2020 or any election. That's not going to get you any political traction. What's going to get you political traction, which gets the left political traction, is talking to the value of the individual voter. You talk about how voting is a right, and we need to give people access, and we need to provide people with the ability to have their voice heard. They're not making a statistical case. They're not talking about evidence of any kind whatsoever. They're talking about what is of value to the person. And we need to do the same thing with medical freedom. So much of the medical freedom debate is focused on the science or lack thereof, and the lack of integrity and the outright fraudulence of the public health sector. And those are cases that need to be made. I'm not saying we should stop making those cases, but our lead case, and the thing we should be circling back to, the thing that should be the headline and the conclusion of every engagement with people outside our echo chamber on this issue, is your role in the governance of your life. Because that's something that hits people square right between the eyes. And the way that I've been approaching it is to just talk about the relationships that people have with other professionals in their life. What is your relationship with your doctor? What is your relationship with your accountant? What is your relationship with your lawyer, if you have one? You don't, by signing these people on as your advisors, you don't enslave yourself to their decision making, right? Like you don't go into the doctor's office and surrender any authority as to what's going to happen to you in there. In fact, you sign all kinds of forms explicitly reiterating patients' rights, informed consent, Anything they do, they're going to explain to you how it works. They're going to answer all your questions. That's part of the marketing too. You know, you want to look at billboards. Hey, you know, we're not just some other doctor. We're right there with you. We're going to make sure you know exactly what's happening. So people appreciate and value and seek out that type of collaborative relationship with an educated professional in the form of a doctor. You don't go into your accountant and say, hey, here's my bank accounts, here's my card, spend my money, decide how it's going to be spent. You don't walk into your lawyer and say, yeah, I'm in trouble with the law. I guess however I'm going to plead is up to you. You know, like that's not how it works. These people have to get your consent, and it has to be informed consent. Why? Why? Because at the end of the day, legally, and more importantly, morally, you own you. You own you. You own your life. You are the decider to evoke W, right? You're the one who gets to decide how your life is going to be disposed of. That is morally correct. It is righteous. It is just. And it should never change. And what's happening right now in public health is the fundamental transformation, the alteration of that standard. We are switching from, and it's the exact same thing that's happening in Virginia with education. And the reason why McAuliffe lost, again, connection, lessons to be learned. McAuliffe came out and said, as a parent, you should not be in charge of your own child. As a parent, you should not be deciding what your kid's going to be taught. In public health, we're being told you shouldn't decide whether or not you get a vaccine. You shouldn't decide whether or not you can try other alternative treatments that can be part of an earlier intervention and potentially avoid hospitalization and death. That's above your pay grade. Your life, your medical care is above your pay grade. You need to listen to the experts. And by listen, they mean obey the orders of. They have completely flipped the script on what the fundamental relationship between a consumer and the producers they choose to patronize is supposed to look like. We talk to people about that. You notice nowhere in my pitch there did I bring up efficacy, infection rates, fatality. None of that is applicable because I'm making a moral argument about, at the end of the day, who should be in charge of you. That's an argument we win.
Well, the moral argument that's being made on the other side is that it shouldn't be up to you. You shouldn't be able to make your decision because what you're doing is infecting or impacting others. And so the moral choice is to do what's good for society, for the whole group. And you brought up the Youngkin McAuliffe race, and I'm thinking back to this MSNBC show I listened to this morning. They talked about how what do Democrats need to do to change on their side to win against this big wave that they see happening in 2022. And they were discussing, well, McAuliffe, we need to change the Democrats from talking, the Republicans have come in and talked about how we're taxing everybody, how we're taking from people, taking choice, taking money, taking everything. And we needed to change that to show how we're actually providing for them, giving them stuff, giving them, helping them make their decisions and, providing. It's like, no, you can't take away choice and then sell it as we're helping you make a choice, or we're helping you decide, or we're giving you free stuff. The government can't give anything to anyone that it hasn't first taken from someone else. So you can't just turn around the narrative. The fact is, Democrats are taking stuff from people. They're taking money from people through taxes, and they're taking away choice. And that you can't spin that any other way. It's not just medical choices. It's about education. It's about everything. And we need to sell freedom and, liberty and choice to the American public and let people say, you can decide what you want to do. We want just less government. That's what we have to sell. That's what's up to us. So.
Well, and I think I want to have that moral argument. Like, I'm totally fine with the left retreating to their moral corner of the ring, because their moral corner of the ring is garbage. It's collectivist nonsense. Their corner of the ring is the same corner that the priests of Molech operated from when they advocated for the village to throw their children into the fire. as a human sacrifice. Their corner is the same corner as the Aztec priests ripping hearts out of their victims' bodies at the top of the pyramid. They are calling for you to sacrifice. When they talk about taking and providing, what they're really talking about is sacrifice. They're saying you should take what is of value to you and throw it away, burn it. Okay? Why? For the common good, for us. And the question has to be asked, well, how can there be a common good apart from the individual good? If it's not good for me, how can it be good for my neighbor? And it's really, and you can get in all kinds of sophistry where they try to defend that and try to make some case for it. But getting them to try to defend that and articulate it very quickly reveals it for what it is. Because a thief, a burglar, could try to make the case that, it's good for me to steal my neighbor's stuff, right? But it's obvious that doesn't work, because if that was the standard, if that was the principle by which everyone operated, then it wouldn't matter what you had, because the next strongest guy down the road would be able to take it from you. And so the only common good that can ever exist, the only common good that is real, is the good of the individual for the individual rights. That is the sole common good. The right to your life, the right to your property, the right to the pursuit of your happiness as you define it, is the sole solitary common good, because without it, somebody is going to be a victim of somebody else.
Those are great words, Walter, and a good way to wrap up the hour and a half Omnibus podcast episode for this week. I hope to. I'd love to plan an agenda for the next episode and throw a teaser out there. Like, we're going to talk about climate change when Biden comes out of his his confused state overseas. Maybe talk about the infrastructure bills that are going to be proposed, and all the green energy crap that's in those bills. But Tim Walz will probably get himself into some trouble, and there'll be some new news that we'll cover the next week's episode. So for those of you still listening, please go out to our new website at theomnibuspodcast.com. theomnibuspodcast.com. I'm going to have some links out to some surveys on legislation, get your thoughts on stuff we should cover here on the show, as well as some surveys we can start referencing. But look forward to it. There's also links to all of the places to download it if you're streaming it through a different service or Facebook or YouTube. There's some links you can just easily subscribe to the podcast so you'll be notified when we publish another episode. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.